I have told this story only twice before, once to a deposition board that didn't believe me, and once to my daughter over the phone the night she turned 19, because I decided she was old enough to know what kind of universe she'd been born into. Both times I left things out. This time I won't. My name is Richard Mercer. I was the medical officer aboard the survey vessel Tancredi, registry number 7 Foxtrot 22, operating under Colonial Authority charter in the Kessler Exclusion Zone, which is a bureaucratic name for the stretch of space that the Vael consider theirs, and which we had been given provisional permission to transit for research purposes. Provisional. I want you to hold that word. The men who wrote it into the Accord sat in pressurized conference rooms on Orbital Station Kepler, 9 months of light lag from anything that might test the definition. I sat in the medical bay of a converted cargo hauler and tried not to think about how many definitions fall apart the moment you need them. The Tancredi carried 11 souls, 2 pilots, a navigation team of 3, 2 xenobiology researchers, a systems engineer named Petra Halst, a communications specialist named Deo Oak, our expedition commander Haruki Yamashiro, and me. 11 people in a ship that had been built to haul ore and was later refitted with sensor arrays and a medical bay the size of a walk-in closet. That was the full complement of humanity inside the exclusion zone on the 14th of March, in what the Colonial Authority still stubbornly called Year 4 of the Accord. I want to be precise about the mission before I talk about what happened, because the deposition record has details wrong and I was there, and the record was not. We were on a spectral survey, measuring thermal and chemical signatures from the planetary bodies inside the zone to build a baseline data model that the Accord Science Annex required before any extraction claims could be filed. It was cartography. It was quiet work, and it was supposed to take 14 days, and on day 9 it stopped being quiet. I also want to be precise about the Vael, because the popular understanding is wrong in ways that matter, and the wrong understanding leads to wrong conclusions about everything that followed. They are not soldiers. They do not carry weapons in any sense we would recognize. They are not, as far as xenobiology has been able to determine, individually conscious the way we are. Each unit is more like a neuron in a distributed brain that spans several hundred ships, and those ships are themselves nodes in a signal web that covers a volume of space roughly the size of our solar system. They don't have cities. They don't have a home planet in any sense that a human geographer would accept. They live in the radio spectrum the way we live in air, immersed in it, dependent on it, shaped by it. Their history is not written in stone or data cores. It is written in the background hum of space itself, in frequency modulations that persist for centuries after they've been made, and that their distributed mind reads the way we read a document. They do not speak. They have never, in 4 years of the Accord and 11 years of contact before it, transmitted anything we can decode as language. What they do very well, and what they have been doing for far longer than we have existed, is interference. The Vael communicate by modifying the background radio spectrum. They don't jam signals. Jamming is crude, obvious, identifiable, the technological equivalent of shouting. What the Vael do is subtler. They reshape the electromagnetic environment across a wide band so that coherent transmission becomes structurally impossible. A signal goes out and returns to the sender as noise not blocked, but scrambled at a level that makes it indistinguishable from the thermal chaos of space itself. Our best communications engineers spent 3 years trying to characterize the mechanism before the lead researcher, Dr. Hana Yui at the Kepler Institute, concluded that the Vael are, in effect, making space itself loud. Loud enough that nothing we know how to say can be heard through it. Loud enough that the concept of a sent message becomes meaningless. There is no receiver, because there is no clean signal, because there is no silence for the signal to cross. The Accord gave us a transit corridor, a narrow lane through the exclusion zone, precisely mapped, with hard boundaries on either side defined by 3 decimal point coordinates that the Colonial Authority had negotiated over 7 months of indirect exchange, mostly hand signals and light pulses, the closest thing to a shared vocabulary we'd found. We were to collect spectral data, stay within the corridor, and not deviate. Commander Yamashiro briefed us on this 11 times during the 17 days before we entered the zone. I counted, because I was the kind of person who counted such things, and because the repetition told me something about the weight Yamashiro was carrying. He was meticulous about the rules not because he was a bureaucrat, he wasn't, but because he understood, better than most, what the Vael did to anything that broke them. We broke them on day 9. It wasn't stupidity, though I've heard it called that in after-action summaries written by people who weren't there, and who have strong feelings about accountability. Our navigation array took a micrometeorite strike to the secondary sensor cluster at 3:40 ship time. The meteorite was roughly the size of a golf ball and hit at an angle that bypassed the collision deflection field. A 1 in 10,000 shot, literally, and not the kind of thing you can plan for. The strike damaged 3 sensors and corrupted the calibration baseline for the 4th. When Yusuf, our lead navigator, Yusuf Adebyo, 26 years in navigation and the calmest man I've ever shared a ship with, ran the standard recalibration sequence at 600, the corridor boundaries came up wrong. Not dramatically wrong. 11 kilometers wrong in the lateral axis. 11 kilometers is nothing in space. In a survey corridor whose boundary tolerance is 2 kilometers, it is everything. We made our course correction at 7:30 with bad navigation data and we crossed the line. We didn't know. That is the thing people find hardest to accept, the thing the deposition board kept pressing on, as if not knowing were itself a kind of negligence. We did not know we had crossed. The instruments said we were inside the corridor. The instruments were wrong. We were 11 kilometers inside Vael-claimed space, flying in a straight line away from where we were supposed to be, with no indication that anything had changed. For 3 hours and 20 minutes, nothing did. The first sign was Deo Oak losing his comm link to the relay satellite. He was running a routine status check, sending a burst of positional data the way he did every 40 minutes, and the acknowledgement didn't come back. He ran diagnostics for 20 minutes before he came to find me. He came to find me, not Yamashiro, which in retrospect tells you something about the state of mind aboard the ship by that point in the mission. We were 9 days in. We were tired. The work had been uneventful to the point of tedium. People were retreating into their own heads. Deo knocked on the medical bay doorframe with his knuckles, the way he always did, and leaned in with one shoulder against the frame, relaxed in posture if not in face. "Doc," he said, "we have a problem." I was cataloging trauma kit supplies for the 3rd time that week. I put down the inventory pad. "What kind?" "The quiet kind." I followed him to the communication station. Every indicator on his board was nominal: power, systems, hardware, software, firmware version. Everything showed green. The diagnostics found nothing wrong with the equipment, and every signal he tried to send returned as garbage. Not silence. Not a carrier tone with no content. Garbage. The formless, indistinguishable roar of a universe that had stopped caring about the difference between a message and its absence. He had been a communications specialist for 14 years. He had worked on 3 survey missions, a Colonial Authority frigate, and 2 years at the Deep Space Relay array past the Kessler boundary. He knew the difference between a system failure and a Vael envelope, the way a cardiologist knows the difference between a skipped beat and a stopped heart. He knew it immediately and completely, and with the particular cold clarity that comes from being certain of something you would very much prefer to be wrong about. He just needed someone else in the room when he said it out loud, because the alternative was saying it to himself, alone, and some things are too heavy to carry without a witness. "How long?" I asked. No way to know. Could have been building for hours. He rubbed the back of his neck. We'd have been inside it before it was strong enough to register. By the time the link dropped, it was already complete. We found Yamashiro in the bridge, already deep in conversation with the pilots. Adiz had the navigation records open and was scrolling through the position logs with the careful speed of someone looking for something they are afraid to find. Yamashiro heard me come in behind Deo and turned, and the look on his face told me he'd already reached the same conclusion we had. "Get everyone together," he said. "Crew common area 5 minutes." That briefing lasted less than 10. Yamashiro was not a man who used words as padding. The summary was this: navigation error, 11 kilometers deviation, Vael interference field confirmed, no outbound communications possible. The Colonial Authority did not know where we were. The nearest rescue asset was 17 hours away if a signal had gotten through, which it hadn't. Our options were to reverse course immediately and hope we exited the field before anything happened, or to hold position, correct the navigation error, and then exit cleanly along an accurate heading. "If we move without accurate navigation," Soren said, he was the senior pilot, a methodical Norwegian with 15 years in deep space and a preference for speaking last, "we risk going deeper." "If we stay still," Adiz said, "we're presenting a stationary target." "We don't know that they treat us as a target," Dr. Diagny said. She was one of the xenobiologists, Fatu Diagny, and she had a voice that remained level even when the content of her words was not. "We have no confirmed instances of the Vael acting against a vessel that stopped and waited within the zone." "We have no confirmed instances of a vessel that stopped and waited within the zone," Yamashiro said. He let that hang for a moment. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with. "We have no data at all on outcomes because nothing that went into this zone uninvited sent back telemetry. We have protocol, and protocol says we exit as quickly as safely possible." He looked at Yusuf. "How long to verify navigation?" Yusuf was honest in the way that good navigators are honest. He didn't soften the number. 3 hours minimum, 5 more likely. The sensor baseline has to be completely rebuilt. I can't rush it without creating more error. "Begin immediately." We dispersed. I went back to the medical bay because there was nothing else for me to do, and because being in motion felt better than standing still in a corridor that suddenly felt like the walls were thinner than they'd been an hour ago. I restocked kits that were already stocked. I ran calibration checks on equipment that was functioning perfectly. I turned the examination table's lighting to its brightest setting, and then turned it back down because the brightness made the room feel more exposed rather than less. Then I sat at my desk and looked at the wall and let myself think about what was outside the hull, which was something I should not have done, and which I did anyway because suppression has never been one of my skills. The Vael, out there in the dark and the radio frequencies, reading the history of the universe in wavelengths too long and too short for human senses to register. Not moving as far as any of our instruments could detect. Not transmitting, or rather transmitting in the sense that the interference field itself was a transmission, a fact of the local electromagnetic environment as simple and pervasive as weather. They didn't know we were afraid. They might not know what afraid was. They might not know what we were. That was the thought that I kept arriving at. They might not know what we were. Not in the way you think about another human being as a what do they want, what do they need, what are they capable of. In a more fundamental sense, we were biological, carbon-based, electrochemical, operating on timescales of decades with sensory ranges that overlap with theirs, if at all, only in the narrowest possible slice of the spectrum. We were insects to a storm. The storm didn't hunt insects. The storm didn't know insects existed. The storm was just the storm. But the storm had noticed us. I was sure of that even then before Deo said it. Something about the quality of the silence, not just the absence of outbound signal, but a presence in the absence, a weight to the quiet that wasn't there before the field closed in. I have been called unscientific for saying this. I accept the characterization and maintain the observation. Petra Hulst found me at the 2-hour mark. She came in without knocking, which was unusual. Petra was Finnish, precise, with a kind of social formality that read as coldness, until you had spent enough time around her to recognize it as respect. Respect for other people's space, other people's work, other people's right to their own interior weather. She took the chair across from my desk and sat with her hands folded on her knees in the particular upright posture of a person who has decided to have a conversation they've been putting off. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "If the Vael move against us, if something happens, what are our chances?" I thought about the careful lie. I am a doctor. Lying to patients is something I've been formally trained in the narrow and specific sense of knowing which lies extend quality of life, and which ones simply delay the reckoning and make the reckoning worse when it comes. Petra Halst was not a patient. She was a systems engineer who had spent 17 years working with physical facts that did not negotiate, and she was asking me a physical question, and she deserved a physical answer. "I don't know," I said. "Nobody does. We have no complete data on outcomes for vessels that entered the exclusion zone without authorization. The ones that went in and didn't come back, we don't know whether they were destroyed, turned away, or simply lost contact and navigated home on dead reckoning and chose not to report it. The absence of data is the data." "But your instinct." I looked at her. "My instinct is that the Vael are not a predatory species. They don't pursue, they don't hunt. They don't, as far as we can tell, conceptualize space the way we do as a territory to be controlled, a resource to be defended. They conceptualize it electromagnetically. We're a noise source inside their signal architecture. I don't think they want to destroy us. I think they want us to stop being noise." "Can we do that?" "We can get out," I said. "That's what Yusuf is working on." She nodded slowly, with the careful head movement of a person processing information they don't entirely want to accept. Then she said, "My daughter is getting married in 6 weeks." I didn't say anything. She wanted me to delay this mission. Not for the wedding specifically, there's enough lead time, I was planning to be back well before. She just had a feeling about it. She said she didn't like how far in we'd be going. Petra's hands, folded on her knees, were completely still. I told her feelings weren't data. "They're not," I said. "No," she looked at the floor. "But data isn't everything, is it? I know this ship. I know every coupling and every sensor relay and every seal on every pressure door because knowing the ship is what keeps you alive if the ship decides to be difficult. I know the Tancredi the way my daughter knows when I'm afraid, even over a video call, even when I'm trying not to show it. That's not data. That's pattern recognition too deep for the instrument to name." She looked up. "I'm afraid, Richard. I want you to know that. I'm afraid, and I'm going to go back to the engine room and keep working because that's what I can do. But I wanted someone to know that I'm afraid." "I know," I said. "And you?" "Yes," I said. She stood. She straightened her jacket with a small, habitual pull at the hem. She paused in the doorframe. "When we're out of this, I'm calling her, first thing." She looked at the corridor beyond, at nothing in particular, and her voice was very quiet. "I should have done it before we left." "You'll do it when we're out," I said. She left. I sat in the medical bay for a long time after, listening to the ship breathe around me, the ventilation cycling, the low pulse of the reactor through the deck plates, the faint creak of metal adjusting to thermal gradients. 11 people in a converted ore hauler, breathing recycled air, waiting to find out if the universe was going to let them leave. At the 4-hour mark, something changed. I felt it before I understood it. Not a sound, not a vibration, something more fundamental than either. The way a shift in barometric pressure registers in your joints before you consciously notice the weather changing. A presence in the absence. The quality of the silence outside the hull shifted in a way I cannot make scientific and have never tried to. Because some things that are real are not replicable in a laboratory, and the inability to replicate them does not make them false. I was halfway out of my chair when I noticed the lights. The medical bay lights hadn't changed, but the light coming through the porthole, the cold, ambient light of deep space, unchanged in character for 9 days, was different. There was a quality to the darkness outside the hull that hadn't been there an hour ago. Not brighter, not darker. Something in between, something my visual cortex was processing as geometry without being able to assign coordinates to it. I went to the porthole and looked. The stars were still there. Between us and them, spreading from some point off the port side, there was a texture to the darkness. Not light, not the absence of light. A pattern, vast and faint and structured in ways that the human eye registered as meaningful while the human mind failed to locate the meaning. The negative image of something so large that what we were seeing was its shadow, cast by electromagnetic emissions we couldn't perceive directly, manifesting as a kind of visual pressure on the edge of perception. I went to the bridge at a full run. Yamashiro was at the central console with both pilots behind him. Yusuf was at the navigation station, and from the look on his face, he had been watching the view screen for at least a minute and had not yet found the words for what he was watching. Dr. Diagne stood at the science station, reading from her instruments with the deliberate stillness of a person who requires composure to process extraordinary data. "What is that?" I said. Not a question. The intonation was wrong for a question. "Vael," Yamashiro said. "Close. Close enough that we could see them with the naked eye. Or rather, close enough that the electromagnetic structure of their presence was dense enough to scatter light in ways that our visual system could register as geometry. There was, to my knowledge, no prior record of a human crew observing Vael structure at visual range and returning to describe it. Every account in the Colonial Authority database was instruments only, hard data, frequency readings, and M profiles. What I was looking at through the view screen had no precedent in any document I had ever read. "They're moving," Dr. Diagne said. Her voice was quiet, matter of fact, as if she were reporting a barometric reading. "Toward us," Yamashiro said. "Toward our position, slowly." Yamashiro turned from the screen. He looked at each of us in turn, not urgently, but with that particular quality of attention he brought to briefings, the look of a man taking inventory of his resources. "Yusuf, where are we on navigation?" 80%, Yusuf said. 14 minutes to full accuracy. "Can you give me a usable heading now at 80%? Yusuf was quiet for 3 seconds. I had learned over 9 days that his silences were calculations, not hesitation. Margin of error is 4 kilometers at the boundary. We might exit the corridor by 4 kilometers. "Might," Yamashiro said. "Might could also be clean. I can't guarantee it at 80%. Yamashiro looked at the view screen. He looked at the pattern in the dark, the structure that was moving slowly toward the 11 of us in our converted ore hauler. He looked at it for 5 full seconds, which is a long time when something very large is moving in your direction. 14 minutes, he said. "We wait, keep working." Nobody argued. The next 40 minutes, 14 to full navigation accuracy, then 23 minutes of transit to the corridor boundary, with 3 minutes of approach time before that, were the longest of my life, and I have a long list of competitors for that title. I have spent 12 hours in surgery. I have sat with a patient through the last night of their life and kept my voice steady while their family wept. I have worked a field hospital during a pressurization incident that killed 6 people and put 17 in critical condition, and forced me to perform triage decisions I still justify to myself on sleepless nights. Nothing before or since matched those 40 minutes on the Tancredi Bridge. Yamashiro kept the crew together by force of personality in the most literal sense I have ever witnessed. Not by inspiration, not by speeches, by the simple fact of standing at the center of the bridge, moving only when movement was required, keeping his voice at exactly the same level when he spoke, whether he was asking for a navigation update or watching the Vael structure drift another degree toward our position. He made thinking feel like action. He made measured response feel like control. This is a very specific kind of leadership, rare in anyone and rarer still in a crisis, and I have spent years trying to understand how he did it and have concluded that it cannot be taught. Some people are simply built so that calm radiates off them like heat off a plate, and other people, in proximity to that calm, find that their own panic has less room to expand. At the 11-minute mark, Petra Halst's voice came over the intercom from the engine room. She said my name, just my name. The tone was the tone of a professional suppressing urgency, and that specific tone, in 14 years of medicine, has never meant anything good. I looked at Yamashiro. He nodded before I could ask. I ran. The engine room was at the Tancredi's aft section, behind two pressure doors that required manual key cycling because the automated systems were slower. I went through both without stopping. Petra was on the deck between the secondary heat exchanger and the starboard power coupling. She was conscious, sitting upright with her back against the coupling housing, which was the first good sign. The second was her eyes, alert, tracking, the eyes of a person who was in pain and had placed the pain in a separate room while she dealt with what needed dealing with. The bad signs were the right arm, which was folded at an angle that told me the radius was gone before I touched her, and the blood on her face from a gash above the eyebrow that would need closing but was not the priority. Housing cracked, she said. Her voice was absolutely level. This impressed me then and impresses me more now with distance. The Vael field does something to the dielectric properties of the insulation. I've been monitoring it for an hour. The degradation has been gradual. The housing failed while I was checking the manual override. I caught the edge on the way down. I knelt and ran my hands over the arm. Compound fracture of the radius mid-shaft. The skin was intact barely. I could feel the displaced bone pressing from inside. She needed a surgical suite, sterile conditions, anesthetic, a reduction pin, and post-operative imaging. She had me on an engine room floor with the emergency kit I'd grabbed on the way out of medical. The coupling, she said. The housing breach means the coupling will fail completely within. She stopped. She looked at the housing. She was doing calculations. 12 minutes, maybe 15. And if it fails completely, we lose 60% of starboard thrust. We can't maintain the exit heading without full thrust. The course geometry requires it. She looked at me. We will not make the corridor. I held her gaze. She held mine. Around us the engine room hummed and vibrated with the sound of a ship that was still, for the moment, operating correctly, and outside the hull something vast and electromagnetically alive was moving toward us, and we had 12 minutes. Tell me what to do, I said. She told me. She talked me through the coupling repair while I improvised a splint for the arm, 2 straps from my kit. A section of conduit she pointed me to, tightened until the radius was stabilized enough that movement wouldn't make it worse. The work was rough and she didn't complain about it. Then she directed my hands on the coupling housing itself, talking in the precise shorthand of an engineer who has memorized her machinery. Left side first, blue terminal, not the gray one. The locking ring requires a quarter-turn counterclockwise before it releases. More torque than you think you need, and then a little more. I followed her the way a medical student follows an attending surgeon, completely, without question, applying expertise I hadn't earned from a source that had. She was directing me through a repair of equipment I had never operated, in a field she had spent 17 years mastering with a broken arm, while the ship counted down. It took 9 minutes. The coupling held. The housing was still compromised. It would need full replacement before the next transit, but the coupling held, and the power transfer resumed at full capacity. And the engine room readouts went from amber to green. I got Petra to her feet. She stood without my help once she was upright, which told me something about the pain and something about the person. We went back through the pressure doors with her good arm over my shoulders, not because she needed the support, but because the corridor was narrow and I wasn't letting her walk it alone, and we came through to the bridge at the 11-minute mark to the corridor. Everyone looked at us. Then they looked at the engine readouts. Nobody asked what had happened in the engine room. They didn't need to. Coupling, Yamashiro said. Temporary, Petra said. Her voice was still level, still carrying the particular professional calm that I had heard in the engine room and which had not, I now understood, been calm at all but something far more deliberate. Good for transit, needs full replacement after. Yamashiro looked at her arm. He said nothing. He turned back to the view screen. 9 minutes. Deo Oak said, I've got something. We all turned. He was bent over his console with headphones pressed hard against one ear, the way he looked when he was pulling a signal out of noise by sheer attention. His face was concentrated in a way that was distinct from the fear that had been on it for the last 40 minutes. This was professional absorption, the face of a man at the intersection of skill and problem. Not clean, he said. Not even close to clean. But there's a pattern in the noise that it's not random. The frequency distribution in the 40 to 60 megahertz band is, he stopped. He pulled the headphones down and looked at us, and his expression was one I've tried to describe for years and never quite managed. The nearest I can get to it is a man who has reached into a dark box expecting to find what he expected to find and has instead touched something alive. Sir, he said, looking at Yamashiro, I think the Vael are transmitting to us. You said they don't use language, Yamashiro said. They don't, this isn't language. He turned back to the console and put the headphones back on, then pulled one cup aside so he could still hear us. The interference field itself is modulated. There's a pattern in the noise. The noise is being shaped. Something is shaping the noise. The bridge was completely silent. Even the ventilation seemed to pause. What does it say? Dr. Diagny asked. She had moved from the science station to stand closer to Deo's console, and she was looking at his readouts with the expression of a person watching data rearrange what they thought they knew. I can't decode it. I don't have any framework to decode it. It's not in any frequency language I've ever seen or read about. He pulled the headphones off entirely and held them in his lap. But it's not random. Something out there is making the noise not random. Outside the view screen, the pattern in the dark had continued its slow drift toward us. It was closer now, close enough that the geometry of its edges was more defined, more legible to the eye even if not to the mind. I stood at the back of the bridge with Petra's weight partially against my shoulder, and I looked at it and thought about what Yamashiro had said in the briefing on our first day in the zone. The Vael don't conceptualize space as territory. They conceptualize it electromagnetically. We were noise in their signal architecture. We were a smear of biological static in the frequencies they used to read the universe. And something in the static had caught their attention. 7 minutes. Yamashiro looked at the view screen. He looked at Deo. He looked at the readouts, the exit heading plotted and locked, the corridor boundary 7 minutes out at current thrust. He stood very still for what might have been 10 seconds and might have been 30, and then he made a decision. Deo, he said, transmit. Deo looked up, sir. Transmit everything. Our registry ID, our identification codes, our distress frequency, the Colonial Authority standard hail. Full spectrum, full power. It'll go out as garbage, Deo said. The field will scramble it before it travels 100 meters. I know. Yamashiro kept looking at the view screen. His voice was entirely ordinary, the same level it had been for every operational order during the whole of the mission. Transmit anyway. Deo held for one beat. His hands moved to his console, deliberate and sure, the hands of a man who has decided. He began transmitting. I want to be precise about what happened in the following 4 minutes because I have been imprecise about it in the past and I owe the record clarity. The Vael structure did not change its bearing. It did not move toward us. It did not move away. What it did, and Dr. Diagny's instrument records, processed 6 hours later when we were back in Colonial Authority sensor range, confirmed this was shift frequency. A subtle shift. Not enough to open a lane through the interference for our signal. not enough to constitute communication in any technical sense. But the shift was in the direction of our transmitted frequency, and the modulation that Deo had identified, the pattern inside the noise, became, measurably, less random in the exact frequency band we were transmitting on. We crossed the corridor boundary at 1:22 p.m. ship time. The moment we crossed, Deo's board went clean. Not gradually. Immediately, completely, as if a switch had been thrown. The interference dropped to nothing. The Colonial Authority signals came flooding back all at once. 14 hours of backed-up positional queries, status requests, automated check-ins, all arriving simultaneously in the sudden silence where the Vael had been. Nobody cheered. Soren let out a breath that had been held for longer than I'd realized. Adiz leaned back in her seat and covered her eyes with one hand and kept them covered for a full 30 seconds. Yusuf sat down on the deck plates, which was not a dignified gesture, and which he didn't appear to care about. Dr. Diagny stared at her instrument readings with the expression of a scientist who has just seen data she's going to spend the next several years trying to properly characterize. Yamashiro stood where he'd been standing, at the center of the bridge, and looked at the view screen, at the ordinary stars, at the darkness that was just darkness again. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned away and began giving orders for the return transit. I walked Petra to the medical bay. The surgery to reduce the fracture took 90 minutes. She insisted on local anesthetic only, a decision I disagreed with and carried out anyway, because she explained, correctly, that she needed to be able to assess engine function by feel and vibration through the transit home, and she didn't trust her proprioception under a general. So she lay on the examination table while I worked around a displaced radius with clamps and manual pressure, and the specific kind of focused misery that orthopedic reduction produces in a patient who is fully conscious. And she talked. Not about the arm, not about the pain, which was considerable. She talked about the engine, which systems were marginal, which coupling would need replacement before we could transit again, which sensor relays had taken degradation from the Vael's interference field and would show up as anomalies in the post-mission inspection. She dictated a repair priority list to me between instructions about where to apply pressure, and I wrote it down between movements of the reduction clamp, and somewhere around the 40-minute mark, I realized that the two of us had developed a rhythm, her directing, me executing. That was the same rhythm we'd found in the engine room. The same calibration of trust between an expert and a fast learner in a situation where there was no time for anything except the work. When the radius was set and the cast applied and the pain medication was finally working, she leaned back on the table and closed her eyes. Her face relaxed. Not completely. I don't think Petra Halst's face ever fully relaxed, but enough that the deep vertical line between her eyebrows softened, and she looked briefly like someone who had put down a weight she'd been carrying for a long time. "I'm going to call her," she said, "first thing. Your daughter. When we're in range." She didn't open her eyes. "I keep thinking about what I should have said before we left. I keep thinking about how she had a feeling and I told her feelings weren't data and I was right, but..." She stopped. Then, I knew she was afraid. I knew it and I filed it away and got on the ship, because there was a mission, because the timeline was fixed, because there's always going to be something else when you're in this work, always another departure. And if you stopped every time, someone who loved you was afraid, you'd never leave the station. "That's true," I said. "It's also insufficient." She finally opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. "You can be right about a fact and insufficient about a person. That's a thing I understand better than I did this morning." "Call her first thing," I said. "First thing," she said. "Not after the debrief, not after the post-mission report, the moment we're in range." The debrief took 3 months, which is 4 weeks longer than the mission itself. Colonial Authority wanted every instrument reading, every log entry, every section of Deo's signal analysis. The communications analysis team spent 6 weeks on the frequency data from the final 4 minutes, and produced a report concluding that the Vael shift was most likely coincidental, that the correlation between our transmission frequency and the subsequent modulation change did not constitute evidence of intentional response, and that further study was required before any conclusions could be drawn. Yamashiro stated his view once in the final debrief session and did not repeat it. His view was this: the Vael had not imposed the interference field in order to silence us. They had imposed it because the interference field was their natural state, their signal environment, their method of existing in electromagnetic space. From their perspective, we were the ones generating interference. We were the noise source. Our transmissions, our navigation signals, our reactor emissions and our comm bursts and our sensor pings, from inside a Vael signal architecture, all of it would read as incoherent static. They were not jamming us. We were jamming them. And when we transmitted into their field anyway, when we sent our identity and our distress and our refusal to go silent into an environment that would make everything we said indecipherable, we had done the one thing that might register to a hive signal intelligence as behavior worth noticing. Not communication, not language, something prior to language, the pattern underneath language, the intention. We were biological static that was trying, desperately and without any reasonable expectation of success, to be heard. Whether the Vael understood that, whether understanding is even the right framework for what a distributed electromagnetic intelligence does with incoming data, is a question that 11 years of additional study has not answered. What I know is what Deo's readouts showed. What I know is what Dr. Diagne's instruments recorded. What I know is that in those 4 minutes between Yamashiro's order and the corridor boundary, the noise changed. Deo Oak received a commendation. He spent the following year writing a paper on frequency modulation analysis in Vael interference fields that became the foundational text for a new subdiscipline. He told me, the last time we spoke, that he still didn't know what the Vael had been saying in the final minutes. He said it with neither frustration nor resignation. He said it the way a person describes a question they intend to spend their life on. Petra Halst attended her daughter's wedding with her arm in a sling. She sent me a brief message 3 months after the debrief. At the end she wrote, "I called her, first thing, she cried, I let her. I have kept that message, I will keep it." Yamashiro retired from Colonial Authority 12 months later, and filed a 112-page recommendation, arguing that the Accord Corridor protocols were built on a fundamental misunderstanding of Vael spatial cognition, and that treating the exclusion zone as territorial defense was a human projection onto a species that didn't organize space that way. Some of what he wrote is now in the revised Accord. He teaches astronavigation at the Orbital Academy and argues with the curriculum committee about first contact theory. I run a trauma unit on a quiet station. Good work. Steady work. Most days I don't think about the view screen at 1:19 p.m. ship time on the 14th of March, with the ordinary stars visible and the darkness between them holding the geometry of something impossibly large and impossibly different from anything we were built to understand. Some days I do. What I return to on those days is not the fear. The fear was real, I won't diminish it. What I return to is Deo's face when he pulled the headphones down, the specific look of a man who has put his hand into a dark space and felt something move. Not frightened, not relieved, struck through with the weight of a thing he could not hold. We had no weapon that could have mattered. We had no speed, no armor, no advantage in any domain the Vael operated in. We had 11 people, a cracked coupling, a broken arm, a navigator rebuilding his baseline by hand, and a communications specialist who kept his headphones pressed to his ear in a field of noise and listened until the noise showed him a pattern. We had a commander who ordered a transmission he knew would be unreadable, because silence felt like surrender, and humans do not surrender to silence. We never have. We have been transmitting into the dark since before we had technology to transmit with, at fires, at graves, at the open sky above the heads of people who died before they could hear the answer. We transmitted the moment we understood there might be something out there to transmit to. And we transmitted before we understood it. And we transmitted when there was no reason at all, except that staying quiet felt like agreeing with the dark. The veil closed off our signals. They compressed our frequencies into noise and made our words indistinguishable from the random thermal static of the universe. They did it, Yamashiro believed, without malice, the way a river doesn't mean anything by being too loud to talk across. They were what they were, and what they were was a species that lived in the electromagnetic spectrum, the way we live in air, and our transmissions were pressure changes in the medium of their existence. They were not trying to silence us, they were simply themselves. And we transmitted anyway. Not because it would work, not because we had any rational expectation of being heard, because it was the only human thing left to do, and we are, underneath everything, all the technology, all the protocol, all the corridors and accords and deposition boards, still the animal that shouts into a storm because it cannot stand to be quiet in the dark. That is the specifically human thing. That has always been the specifically human thing. You can take our signals. You can make our frequencies unreadable, collapse our transmissions into noise, impose an electromagnetic reality in which the very concept of a received message becomes structurally impossible. We will transmit anyway. Into the void, across distances no reasonable calculus could justify, in frequencies we're not certain anything is listening to. We will send our name and our location and the signal that means I am here, I exist, I am trying to reach you, and we will send it again, and again, and again, until either something answers or we run out of time. We have been sending it since before we had words for what we were sending it to. That is not bravery, exactly. Bravery is a choice made in full knowledge of the alternative. This is something older and less voluntary than choice. This is the species, doing what the species does, the same thing it has always done, on Earth and in orbit and in the exclusion zones of species that make space itself too loud for anyone to hear. We did not save ourselves with a weapon or a speed or a power. We saved ourselves with a cracked coupling repaired by a woman with a broken arm directing a doctor who had never touched the component, and with a transmission sent into an environment that would make it unreadable, and with Yamashiro standing at the center of the bridge being the stillest person in the room, so that everyone else had something steady to measure against. And in those final 4 minutes, the darkness shifted its frequency toward the sound of us, just slightly, just enough to measure. Whether that was communication or coincidence, I leave to the committee reports. I was there. I saw what I saw. I know what I know. The veil heard us trying. I believe that. I cannot prove it. But I believe it, the way I believe the things that happened in that engine room, the way I believe Petra Halst's voice when she said first thing, the way I believe that Deo kept his headphones on and his hands on his console even when the logical conclusion was that nothing he did could reach anything. That's what we do, even when the storm is too loud, even when the math says stop. We keep trying to reach each other. That is enough. It has always been enough. It has to be. There is one more thing. I haven't told either version of this story. And I'm going to tell it now because this is the version I intend to be the last one, and omitting it would be its own kind of failure. 3 weeks after the debrief, I received a message from a Colonial Authority psychologist assigned to post-incident follow-up. Standard protocol. She asked how I was sleeping, whether I was experiencing intrusive thoughts about the event, whether the scope of the Vael encounter felt manageable or overwhelming. I answered her questions honestly. The answers were adequately, yes, and both simultaneously, depending on the day. She asked at the end of the session whether there was anything about the experience I wished had gone differently. I thought about it for longer than she probably expected. I thought about the navigation error, and whether a different calibration protocol would have caught it, probably yes, and the authority has since changed the standard. I thought about Petra in the engine room, and whether a different inspection schedule would have identified the dielectric problem before the housing cracked. Possibly, though the Vael field's specific effect on insulating materials wasn't in any manual. I thought about the 14 hours of unanswered signals that had piled up while we were in the field, and the Colonial Authority's response protocols, and whether faster response could have reached us. No, it could not. Physics doesn't negotiate. And then I thought about Yamashiro's order, transmit anyway. No, I told her, I don't wish anything had gone differently. She looked at me with the particular expression of a professional who suspects she's being given a managed answer. Nothing at all. I'd rather not have been 11 kilometers off course, I said, but given that we were nothing. She wrote something down. Can you say more about that? We were inside the Vael's signal environment, I said. We were inside something we can't fully characterize, something that doesn't work by any of the rules we were trained on. We had no leverage. We had no exit strategy that we could guarantee. We had protocol that told us what to do in a situation that protocol was not built for, and we followed it as closely as we could, and in the end we transmitted into a field that would make the transmission meaningless, and then we went home. And that was the right thing to do, she said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the only thing to do, I said. Not because it worked. I don't know if it worked. Because it was the only response we had that was ours. Everything else was in the Vael's hands, the field, the interference, the proximity, whatever they were transmitting at us in those last minutes. Staying silent would have been in their hands too. Transmitting was ours. It was the only decision we could make that was entirely our own. She wrote that down as well. Do you think the Vael understood that? I've been thinking about that question ever since. Not obsessively. I have work to do, and a daughter I talk to more often than I used to, and a life that is structured around the present in ways that the 14th of March made me deliberately more interested in. But I come back to it, the way you come back to a sentence in a book that keeps meaning something different depending on when you read it. I don't know whether the Vael understood. I don't know if understanding is the right category for whatever they do with the electromagnetic data they collect. I don't know if our transmission, our insistence on transmitting into a field that would swallow it whole, registered as anything other than a property of the noise source that was occupying a portion of their signal environment. But I know this. In those 4 minutes, the noise source didn't stop making noise. And the Vael, which had no particular reason to notice one way or another, shifted their frequency toward ours. That's a fact. Documented in Dr. Diagne's instrument record, reviewed by the Colonial Authority's signals analysis team, reproducible in the data if you know what to look for. Not communication, not necessarily intentional, but a fact. I have a photograph on the wall of my office, not of space, not of the Tancredi, not of any of the 11 people on that ship, because I find I don't need those reminders and they create a kind of gravity that I find I'm better without. It's a photograph taken from the surface of the first Kessler colony world, looking up at night. An ordinary sky. Stars, the same stars that exist everywhere you go in our corner of the galaxy. The photograph was taken during the first winter there, 20 years ago, when the colony was still establishing itself, and the population was small enough that the light pollution was minimal, and the sky was dark in a way that you can't find on Earth anymore. Nothing in the photograph is remarkable, except that it was taken by someone who had decided to go there, to a cold planet in an exclusion zone adjacent to a species that could make the universe too loud to hear through, and point a camera at the sky. Not looking for anything in particular, just looking, just maintaining the habit of looking outward, which is the habit we have never, in all the time we have been the thing we are, been able to fully break. We keep looking. We keep transmitting. We keep sending the signal into the static. Whether anything is listening, I can tell you that sometimes when you transmit into the dark shifts frequency just slightly toward the sound of you. I've seen it happen. That's enough for me. There's a particular quality to the silence that follows a close call in deep space, and it's different from any other silence I know. It's not the silence of relief, though relief is present. It's not the silence of exhaustion, though everyone on the Tancredi Bridge in those minutes after crossing the boundary was running on fumes and discipline, and very little else. It's the silence of recalibration, the moment after a storm when the air is still wrong, still charged, still tasting of something that was very recently very dangerous, and the ordinary world has come back but hasn't quite been trusted yet. We held that silence for about 4 minutes. Then Yamashiro said, "Deo, status." Deo had his headphones off. He was sitting with them in his lap, turning them over slowly in both hands, not anxiously, but the way a craftsman handles a familiar tool after it surprised him with what it can do. "Signal clear," he said. "All Colonial Authority frequencies. Full relay contact. The envelope dropped completely the moment we crossed. Record everything from the last 20 minutes. Full analysis copy to Dr. Diagni." "Already running," Deo said. Yamashiro nodded. "A D's course for the relay beacon." "Plotted," she said. She had her eyes open again. Her voice was steady and she was already moving, hands on the helm console, shoulders squared, every centimeter of her body broadcasting the particular competence of a person who is very good at their job and knows it. Transit time 4 hours 30 minutes at standard. "Make it so." The phrase was so ordinary, so operationally mundane, that it took me a moment to register what had just happened. That we had in fact made it, that the Tancredi was pointing toward home, and the Vael were behind us, and Petra Halst was still alive, and Deo's signal analysis was running, and we were all of us going to get to have a conversation about this at some point in the future, which is a thing that people who don't come back from things never get to do. Yusuf got up from the deck. He brushed off his uniform, which didn't need brushing, and took his station with the dignity of a man who has decided that sitting on the floor is a thing that happened and has now concluded. I caught his eye briefly. He said nothing. I said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying in that direction, and we both knew it. I thought about Deo's 4 minutes of transmission. I thought about what it cost him, professionally, transmitting into a known interference field, burning power on a signal he had every technical reason to know would never arrive, following an order that could be criticized as resource waste in a post-incident review. It cost him nothing in the end, because the review was sympathetic and the outcome was good, but he didn't know that when he put his hands on the console. He knew only that Yamashiro had told him to transmit, and that transmitting into the field was something he could do, and that the alternative was silence, and that silence in a communication station is a kind of death. There's a line Deo used in his paper on Vael interference that I've returned to more than any other piece of technical writing I've read in the years since. He wrote, "The frequency shift observed in the final 4.2 minutes of transit cannot be explained by current models of Vael interference field dynamics, and may represent either an unmapped property of the field under certain conditions, or evidence of a responsive modulation behavior not previously documented. Both interpretations require further study. What can be stated with confidence is that the shift was not consistent with random variation, and that it was temporally correlated with a deliberate transmission by the survey vessel Tancredi. The nature of any causal relationship between these events remains, at this time, an open question." An open question. 14 years of study and still an open question. I think it will be an open question for a very long time. I think that's acceptable. I think the open question is, in its way, a kind of answer not about the Vael but about us. About the fact that we are the species that stands in a storm and transmits anyway, and then spends the next 14 years trying to understand whether anything hurt us. Because the possibility that something hurt us is too important to dismiss, and too unconfirmed to claim, and we are constitutionally incapable of leaving important things alone. We are the species that keeps asking. That too is enough.